Sunday, December 17, 1945, dawned quietly in Europe, just days before Christmas and barely a week after General George S. Patton, Jr. had been involved in a devastating automobile accident near Mannheim, Germany. On that cold winter morning, as World War II had officially ended months earlier, but its consequences still shaped every decision and memory, Patton dictated what would become one of his final letters. His body was broken, his neck immobilized, and his future uncertain, yet his mind remained fixed on duty, legacy, and the men he had fought beside. Among the names he chose to speak about in those last days, one stood out with particular weight: Omar Nelson Bradley. Patton and Bradley had known each other for decades. They were West Point classmates, both graduating in 1915, the class famously described as the class the stars fell on, because so many would later become generals. Their careers rose in parallel through the interwar years, shaped by mechanized warfare, staff assignments, and shared experiences that forged professional respect but also quiet rivalry. By the time World War II erupted, both men were central figures in the American Army, yet their personalities, leadership styles, and public reputations could not have been more different. Bradley was known as the soldier's general, calm, methodical, and deeply concerned with minimizing casualties. Patton, by contrast, cultivated an image of aggression, speed, and relentless offense. He believed wars were won by bold action and constant pressure on the enemy. Despite these differences, Patton recognized Bradley's competence and reliability, even when their approaches clashed. That recognition, expressed in Patton's final letter, carries particular significance because Patton was not a man prone to casual praise. At the time Patton dictated the letter, Bradley had become one of the most powerful military figures in the world. He was serving as head of the Veterans Administration and was soon to be appointed the first chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. During World War II, Bradley had commanded the First Army during the Normandy invasion and later led the 12th Army Group, the largest formation of American forces ever assembled. Patton, meanwhile, had commanded the Third Army, executing some of the most rapid and aggressive maneuvers of the war, particularly during the breakout from Normandy and the relief of Bastogne. The relationship between the two men had been tested during the war, especially after the infamous slapping incidents in Sicily in 1943. When Patton struck two hospitalized soldiers suffering from what would later be understood as combat stress, it was Bradley who reported the incidents up the chain of command. The fallout nearly ended Patton's career. For months he was sidelined, while Bradley continued to rise. Many historians have debated whether Bradley acted out of professional duty, personal resentment, or a genuine concern for discipline and morale. Patton himself never fully forgot the episode. Yet in his final letter, Patton's tone toward Bradley was not bitter. Instead, it was reflective, restrained, and revealing. Knowing he might not recover, Patton appeared focused on setting the historical record straight, expressing his true assessments of the men who had shaped World War II alongside him. His words about Bradley were measured, acknowledging both Bradley's strengths and the fundamental differences between them. Patton referred to Bradley as a steady and dependable commander, a man well suited to the immense administrative and organizational burdens of large-scale warfare. In World War II, logistics, supply chains, and coordination across vast fronts were as decisive as battlefield heroics. Patton understood this, even if he personally gravitated toward maneuver warfare and dramatic advances. His letter suggests that he recognized Bradley as the kind of leader the American Army needed to sustain a global conflict. At the same time, Patton subtly contrasted Bradley's caution with his own philosophy. He believed that Bradley's reluctance to take risks sometimes slowed operations and allowed enemy forces to escape destruction. This tension had been evident during the Normandy campaign, when Patton pushed for aggressive exploitation of breakthroughs, while Bradley favored consolidation and secure lines. Patton's letter did not frame this as incompetence, but as a difference in temperament and doctrine. The historical context of these remarks is crucial. By December 1945, World War II had fundamentally reshaped military thinking. The scale of destruction, the mobilization of entire societies, and the emergence of the United States as a global superpower forced leaders to reconsider what effective command truly meant. Patton, once celebrated as a wartime hero, increasingly felt out of place in the post-war world. Bradley, by contrast, embodied the kind of restrained, politically adept leadership that would dominate the early Cold War. Patton's letter also reflects an awareness of legacy. He knew that history would judge the generals of World War II not only by victories, but how they conducted themselves and how they fit into the broader narrative of Allied success. His words about Bradley suggest an effort to be fair, even generous, despite past frustrations. This restraint is striking given Patton's reputation for bluntness and emotional intensity. The letter reveals that Patton saw Bradley as loyal to the institution of the Army above all else. In Patton's view, Bradley represented continuity, stability, and adherence to process. These qualities were essential for managing millions of soldiers across multiple theaters. Patton, on the other hand, saw himself as a weapon to be used at critical moments, not as an administrator or long-term steward of the military establishment. This distinction becomes even more meaningful when viewed through the lens of World War II coalition warfare. The Allied effort required constant negotiation between American, British, and other Allied commanders. Bradley's calm demeanor and diplomatic approach made him well-suited to this environment. Patton, though respected by allies like Bernard Montgomery for his fighting spirit, often strained relationships through his rhetoric and uncompromising style. In his final letter, Patton did not deny these realities. Instead, he acknowledged that Bradley's approach had value, particularly in a war where coordination and unity were as important as battlefield brilliance. This acknowledgement does not diminish Patton's own achievements. Rather, it underscores his understanding of war as a complex human and organizational endeavor. The emotional weight of the letter is heightened by Patton's physical condition. Immobilized, in pain, and facing the possibility of permanent paralysis, he was forced into a kind of reflection that his fast-paced wartime life had rarely allowed. World War II had been defined by motion, by rapid advances and sudden reversals. Now, Patton was still, confined to a hospital bed, looking back on a lifetime of service. His thoughts about Bradley also reveal a sense of unfinished business. Patton believed that the war against authoritarianism was not truly over, and he had grown increasingly vocal about the threat posed by the Soviet Union. Bradley, aligned closely with Eisenhower, represented a more cautious post-war approach that emphasized stability and diplomacy. Patton's letter hints at this ideological divide without explicitly arguing it. The respect Patton expressed for Bradley was not unconditional admiration, but professional acknowledgement. He recognized Bradley as a man who had performed his duties effectively within the framework of World War II as it was fought, not as Patton might have preferred it to be fought. This distinction is subtle but important, and it reflects Patton's lifelong habit of evaluating commanders based on results rather than personal affinity.
As historians have examined Patton's final letter, they have noted its lack of theatrics. There are no grand speeches, no dramatic condemnations. Instead, there is a sober assessment of people and events, written by a man who knew he was approaching the end of his story. His words about Bradley fit this pattern, offering insight without spectacle. The letter also challenges simplified narratives about rivalry and resentment. While Patton and Bradley differed sharply in style, Patton's final assessment suggests that he did not see Bradley as an enemy or a betrayer, but as a different kind of soldier, shaped by the demands of World War II. This nuance is often lost in popular portrayals that emphasize conflict over complexity. Patton's acknowledgement of Bradley's role also reflects his understanding of command responsibility. Leading millions of men required compromise, patience, and political awareness. Patton excelled at breaking enemy lines. Bradley excelled at holding vast forces together. Both roles were indispensable, and Patton's letter implicitly recognizes this interdependence. The broader significance of Patton's words lies in what they reveal about leadership under extreme pressure. World War II forced commanders to confront moral dilemmas, institutional constraints, and personal limitations. Patton's final reflections show a man grappling with these realities, even as his own time ran out. His remarks about Bradley also offer a glimpse into how Patton wanted to be remembered. By acknowledging Bradley's strengths, he positioned himself not as a lone genius surrounded by mediocrity, but as part of a larger team that achieved victory through diverse talents. This perspective adds depth to Patton's legacy and complicates the image of him as purely egotistical. The letter's timing, written in the immediate aftermath of World War II, gives it additional historical weight. The world was transitioning from total war to uneasy peace, and military leaders were being redefined in the public eye. Bradley's rise symbolized continuity and restraint, while Patton's fading presence symbolized the passing of a more visceral style of command. In this context, Patton's words about Bradley serve as a bridge between wartime experience and post-war reality. They acknowledge that World War II was won not by a single philosophy, but by the combined efforts of commanders with different strengths and limitations. Patton's final letter remains a valuable document for understanding the human dimension of World War II leadership. It strips away some of the mythology and reveals a man capable of reflection, balance, and even generosity toward those with whom he disagreed. His assessment of Omar Bradley stands as a testament to professional respect forged in the crucible of history. The fact that these words were among Patton's last adds a layer of poignancy. He did not have the chance to revise, expand, or contextualize them further. What remains is a snapshot of his thinking at the end of his life, shaped by pain, memory, and an unshakable commitment to the truth as he saw it. Through this letter, Patton speaks not only about Bradley, but about the nature of command itself. World War II demanded leaders who could adapt, collaborate, and endure. Patton's acknowledgement of Bradley's role affirms that victory was a collective achievement, even among men who disagreed deeply about how wars should be fought. As the world moved on from World War II, Bradley would become one of the architects of the modern American military, while Patton would become a legend frozen in time. Yet in Patton's final letter, these two figures meet one last time, not on a battlefield, but in reflection, offering historians a rare and intimate glimpse into how one of history's most famous generals judged his longtime peer.
The letter does not close the story. Instead, it opens further questions about leadership, rivalry, and memory in the aftermath of World War II, leaving space for continued exploration of how personal relationships shaped the conduct and outcome of the most devastating conflict in human history. The questions raised by Patton's final reflections become even more significant when examined against the broader emotional landscape of senior American commanders after World War II. Many of these men had spent years making decisions that cost thousands of lives, often under incomplete information and intense political pressure. Patton's remarks about Bradley suggest an awareness that judgment in war is rarely absolute. Success and failure are often separated by circumstance, timing, and the personalities involved, rather than by simple measures of brilliance or caution. In the months following Germany's surrender, informal conversations among senior officers revealed a quiet reassessment of wartime leadership. Patton's letter fits within this atmosphere of reevaluation. His acknowledgement of Bradley's strengths indicates that, stripped of competition and immediate command pressures, he could view their relationship with greater clarity. World War II had forced both men into roles larger than themselves, roles defined not only by personal preference but by strategic necessity and political reality. Bradley's rise during the war had also been shaped by his relationship with Dwight Eisenhower, whose trust in Bradley dated back to North Africa. Patton understood this dynamic well. In his private writings, he often contrasted Eisenhower's preference for consensus and coalition management with his own desire for decisive action. Bradley, in Patton's mind, functioned as an extension of Eisenhower's command philosophy, emphasizing coordination and stability across the Allied front. This alignment further explains why Patton viewed Bradley as indispensable, even when he disagreed with him. The letter subtly reflects Patton's belief that World War II rewarded conformity as much as audacity. He had thrived when rapid advances and battlefield chaos allowed aggressive commanders to shape events. As the war progressed and fronts stabilized, the balance shifted toward leaders capable of managing immense organizations. Bradley's effectiveness in this environment did not negate Patton's contributions, but it highlighted how different phases of the war elevated different kinds of leadership. Patton's tone also suggests an understanding that historical reputation is shaped as much by narrative as by action. Bradley's public image as a calm, humane commander resonated strongly with a war-weary public. Patton, aware of his own controversies, seemed to recognize that Bradley's temperament aligned better with the mood of a nation transitioning from total war to peace. World War II had ended, but the memory of its violence lingered, and leaders who embodied restraint were increasingly valued. This awareness adds depth to Patton's comments. Rather than dismissing Bradley's caution as weakness, he framed it as a characteristic shaped by responsibility. Commanding vast armies required an acceptance of limits, an understanding that not every opportunity could be exploited without risk. Patton's letter indicates that at the end of his life, he could acknowledge these constraints without abandoning his own convictions about how wars should be fought. The contrast between the two men also reflects differing views on the relationship between soldiers and the institution they served. Bradley identified closely with the Army as an organization, prioritizing cohesion, discipline, and sustainability. Patton identified more closely with the art of war itself, seeing institutions as tools rather than ends. World War II required both perspectives, and Patton's final assessment implicitly recognizes this duality. Patton's reflections further reveal his sensitivity to how history would interpret command decisions. He understood that Bradley's choices during World War II would be analyzed in hindsight, often without full appreciation of the pressures involved. By acknowledging Bradley's competence, Patton positioned himself as a witness to those pressures, offering future historians a perspective grounded in shared experience rather than rivalry. The letter also hints at Patton's belief that war exposes character more than it creates it. Bradley's steadiness, in Patton's view, was not a product of World War II alone, but a trait refined by it. This distinction matters because it frames leadership as an extension of personal disposition rather than a set of interchangeable skills. Patton saw himself and Bradley as fundamentally different men, responding differently to the same historical moment. As scholars examine this document, they often note how little resentment it contains. Given Patton's outspoken nature, this restraint is striking. It suggests that facing his own mortality, Patton prioritized accuracy over emotion. His assessment of Bradley was not an attempt to settle old scores, but to articulate a truth shaped by years of shared service. The letter's educational value lies in its ability to humanize figures often reduced to caricature. World War II commanders are frequently portrayed as symbols rather than individuals, their decisions flattened into simplistic narratives of heroism or failure. Patton's words about Bradley disrupt these narratives by acknowledging complexity, uncertainty, and the legitimacy of differing approaches to command. This complexity extends to the moral dimensions of leadership. Bradley's emphasis on minimizing casualties reflected a belief that commanders bore responsibility not only for victory, but for the lives entrusted to them. Patton, while accepting casualties as inevitable, believed that decisive action could shorten wars and ultimately save lives. World War II provided evidence for both arguments, and Patton's letter does not attempt to resolve this tension, only to acknowledge it. The continued relevance of these reflections becomes clear when considering how modern military doctrine evolved after World War II. The balance between aggression and restraint, initiative and control, remains central to command philosophy. Patton's assessment of Bradley offers an early articulation of this balance, grounded in lived experience rather than abstract theory. The absence of finality in Patton's words mirrors the unfinished nature of historical interpretation itself. His letter does not close debates about leadership, rivalry, or effectiveness. Instead, it invites further examination of how personal relationships shaped strategic outcomes during World War II. By focusing on Bradley, Patton also indirectly comments on himself. His acknowledgement of another commander's strengths suggests a desire to be understood in context, not as an isolated figure, but as part of a complex command ecosystem. This perspective challenges narratives that portray World War II victories as the result of singular genius. The enduring interest in this letter reflects a broader fascination with how great leaders perceive one another when stripped of public performance. Patton's final assessment of Bradley provides a rare moment of candor, offering insight into private evaluations that shaped public decisions. As historians continue to analyze World War II, documents like this letter remain invaluable. They reveal not only what happened, but how those who shaped events understood them in retrospect. Patton's words about Bradley stand as an invitation to explore leadership as a human endeavor, marked by disagreement, respect, and shared responsibility. The story that emerges from this reflection does not conclude with Patton's death or Bradley's rise. It extends into how World War II is remembered, taught, and debated, leaving open questions about the nature of command, the price of victory, and the relationships that define history itself.
Those open questions gain further depth when placed against the institutional changes that followed World War II. Changes that both validated and complicated Patton's final assessment of Omar Bradley. As the American military transitioned into a permanent global force, the qualities Bradley embodied became increasingly central to doctrine and structure. Long-term planning, alliance management, and political sensitivity were elevated alongside combat effectiveness. Patton, had he lived, would have found himself operating in a system that increasingly favored Bradley's temperament, a reality he seemed to sense even in his final days. The early Cold War environment reinforced this shift. The United States no longer fought short, decisive campaigns against clearly defined enemies, but entered an era of deterrence, containment, and prolonged readiness. Bradley's approach to leadership, shaped during World War II by coalition warfare and massive organizational responsibility, translated naturally into this new context. Patton's letter, read through this lens, appears almost prescient, acknowledging that the kind of war he excelled at was giving way to a different strategic reality.
This does not diminish Patton's relevance, rather it reframes it. His aggressive doctrine influenced armored warfare, operational maneuver, and the emphasis on initiative that remains a cornerstone of military education. Bradley's influence, meanwhile, shaped command structures, joint operations, and civil-military relations. World War II thus produced complementary legacies, and Patton's recognition of Bradley's role underscores an understanding that victory required both philosophies operating in tension. The human element of this tension becomes clearer when examining how both men were remembered by the soldiers who served under them. Veterans often described Patton as terrifying, inspiring, and unpredictable, a commander whose presence signaled imminent action. Bradley was remembered as approachable, calm, and attentive to the welfare of his troops. Patton's letter suggests that he understood these perceptions and accepted that they reflected genuine differences rather than misinterpretations. In reflecting on Bradley, Patton also confronted the limits of charisma. World War II elevated charismatic leaders, but it also exposed the risks of personality-driven command in large, complex organizations. Bradley's understated style proved effective precisely because it did not rely on spectacle. Patton's acknowledgement of this effectiveness suggests a late appreciation for forms of leadership that did not align with his own instincts. The letter's language further indicates that Patton viewed Bradley as a stabilizing force during moments of crisis. In campaigns where coordination faltered or Allied unity was strained, Bradley's steadiness provided continuity. Patton, aware of his own volatility, appears to have recognized the value of having such a counterbalance within the command structure of World War II. This recognition adds a layer of irony to Patton's legacy. He is often remembered as a singular figure, yet his final reflections emphasize interdependence. By acknowledging Bradley's contributions, Patton implicitly rejects the notion that World War II was won by isolated brilliance. Instead, it presents it as the product of collective effort shaped by diverse strengths. The educational significance of this perspective is considerable. It challenges simplified narratives that dominate popular history and encourages a more nuanced understanding of command dynamics. Patton's letter becomes not just a personal document, but a teaching tool, illustrating how leaders evaluate one another beyond public image and wartime propaganda. As subsequent generations of officers studied World War II, Bradley's career was often held up as a model of professional conduct, while Patton's was studied for operational daring and the consequences of unchecked intensity. Patton's final assessment bridges these interpretations, suggesting that effective leadership cannot be reduced to a single template.
The absence of closure in Patton's words mirrors the ongoing evolution of military thought. Each era revisits World War II, seeking lessons applicable to new challenges. Patton's reflections on Bradley remain relevant precisely because they resist final judgment, offering instead an invitation to compare, contrast, and reflect. This openness is perhaps the most striking aspect of the letter. Faced with his own mortality, Patton did not seek to simplify history in his favor. He acknowledged complexity, even ambiguity, recognizing that Bradley's approach was not a lesser version of his own, but a response to different demands within the same war. The enduring fascination with this document lies in its restraint. Patton, known for theatrical language and emotional intensity, chose moderation when assessing a man who had played a role in his professional setbacks. This restraint suggests a conscious effort to speak truthfully rather than dramatically, reinforcing the letter's value as a historical source. In examining these reflections, historians gain insight not only into Patton and Bradley, but into the psychological burden carried by senior commanders of World War II. Their decisions shaped millions of lives, and their post-war reflections reveal an awareness of that responsibility that rarely surfaces in battlefield narratives.
The letter also underscores how rivalry can coexist with respect. Patton and Bradley competed for influence, resources, and recognition, yet Patton's final words show that competition did not erase professional acknowledgement. This dynamic offers a more realistic portrayal of leadership than stories that frame relationships as purely adversarial. As time passes, the distance between myth and reality continues to grow. Patton's final letter acts as a corrective, grounding discussion of World War II leadership in lived experience rather than legend. His assessment of Bradley resists hero worship and instead emphasizes function, responsibility, and context. The conversation Patton began in that hospital room did not end with his death. It continues in classrooms, military academies, and historical debates where scholars and officers alike examine how different leadership styles interact under extreme conditions. Bradley's career, viewed through Patton's eyes, becomes part of a larger dialogue about the nature of command. In this way, the letter remains unfinished by design. It does not offer resolution, but continuity, extending the story of World War II beyond battles and campaigns into questions of memory, judgment, and legacy. Patton's final words about Omar Bradley ensure that their shared history remains a living subject, open to reinterpretation as long as the war itself remains central to understanding the modern world.